I'm Dr. Laura Bradley and I'm a senior lecturer in German at the University of Edinburgh. I've been a fan of Brecht for many years. Brecht had been thinking about writing a play about this topic for a long time, since the 1920s. He actually wrote the Caucasian Chalk Circle in 1944, and that was a time when he was living in California in exile, and he'd been living away from his home country for 11 years. It was a time when the tide had just turned in the Second World War, and the Allies were winning the fight against Hitler. And so Brecht was starting to imagine the sort of society that might emerge after that war, and how it needed to be different from what had gone before. So that was why he set it in the Caucasus, because it was the first part of the Soviet Union to be liberated from the Nazi occupying forces. Brecht's great contribution really to political theatre was his understanding that political theatre was not just about ideas and content. It was not just about what you told audiences, but the way in which you communicated your ideas. Political theatre for Brecht is about form as well as content. He thought you needed to change the way in which audiences actually thought, rather than just what they thought. And Brecht had two ideas that were really crucial. The first is the idea of epic theatre, which his name has become very strongly identified with. And central to the idea of epic theatre is the idea that the audience is watching a story, not a slice of life, but a story that's being told for a reason and from a particular perspective. Now we see that very clearly in the Caucasian Chalk Circle, because we have the play within a play, and then we have the narrator, the singer, on stage. And in fact, he's introduced carrying a book, and he's got all his page markers in the book. We see him flipping forwards and backwards in the story, focusing on the bits that he thinks are important for the audience. Another key idea of Brecht's is the idea of alienation. Now, alienation has created an awful lot of misunderstandings, particularly in the English-speaking world. And that's because we tend to associate alienation with lack of feeling, coldness, feeling very cut off from what we're watching on stage. Now, that's not what Brecht was about. Brecht wanted his spectators to be really passionate and engaged in what they were watching. And I think alienation is quite a misleading translation of the term that Brecht actually used, a term Verfremdung, which is much closer to the idea of estrangement. It's the idea of making things that we usually take for granted seem unfamiliar, seem strange, so that we have to start thinking about them. So the idea in this play, of course, the idea of motherhood. What do we understand motherhood to be? Is it just because you've given birth to a child, or is it because of what you can give the child? So that making things strange is crucial. It's making things seem strange so that we can start to question them. Epic theatre is a theatre that's all about the spectator. It's all about empowering the spectator to be active and to watch critically, rather than just sort of leaning back in their seat and passively consuming the whole performance. So Brecht tries to create the space for the spectator to think about what they're watching. So we have breaks in the action, we have shifts of scene, we have shifts of location or changes in the characters that we're watching, to make us sort of think, and oh gosh, I've got to reorientate myself in this play, figure out what the connections are between these Soviet farmers that we saw in the prologue, Grusha, and then the crazy judge Azdak. So it's all about empowering the audience to watch critically, and also giving the audience the space to react differently and to experience different feelings from the characters on stage. I mean, Brecht wrote this great little essay about how spectators react to epic theatre compared to how they react to more conventional dramatic theatre. And he says that the point is that the spectator of dramatic theatre feels exactly the same emotions as the character on stage. If the character on stage cries, the spectator cries. If they laugh, the spectator laughs. The spectator of epic theatre laughs when the character on stage cries. He cries when they laugh. He feels that the play is tragic if there's a way out but the character fails to see it. not simply because the character's fate is inescapable. So it's all about making sure that the spectator has the freedom, the space to experience things differently from the characters on stage. He allows us to be independent, and he forces us to be independent and critical when we're watching his theatre. The idea about the fourth wall is that the actors on stage pretend that there's an invisible wall between them and the audience. So the actors on stage don't acknowledge that there is an audience in front of them. They pretend that they're sealed off in their own reality. Brecht completely tore down that fourth wall. He wanted to show that the theatre was being put on for a purpose because it was relevant to the reality of the audience watching it. So he didn't try and hide away any of the mechanics of the production. He would have scene changes going on in full view of the audience. He would show the apparatus of the stage lights and so on, so that the audience could see that this wasn't some illusion of reality. It was something constructed, something artificial that was being put on explicitly because it had a relevance to them and had something important to say, an important story to tell. Brecht is really important because he's a theatrical genius, and that's no exaggeration at all. He is a playwright who writes with a theatre inside his mind. He really exploits all of the potential that theatre has to offer, and he can play with language. He's got this incredible knack for turning language on its head, for making you think and making you challenge your assumptions about the world and the way it works. So I think the first reason why Brecht is really important to us now is just because of his theatrical imagination and the fact that his plays are so worth watching, so entertaining and rewarding. And another reason is that he challenges us to think about the world in which we live and challenge our assumptions and not take things for granted, but to hope and work for something better. Well, I think Brecht is somebody who never lost the curiosity of his youth. I think when we first encounter the world, then we don't take things for granted. You know, anyone who's looked after young kids knows that they constantly ask why, and you can get really sick of them totally, always asking why the whole time. And Brecht never stopped doing that. He never stopped questioning the world and the way it was. I think Brecht is still very much relevant today. If you think about the sorts of questions he asks in his plays and in his poetry, they're questions that still matter, that still gnaw away at us today. Questions about social justice, questions about whether it's possible for the poor and underprivileged to get a fair deal in society, questions about the roles that banks and corporations have to play, and questions about politics and the way in which politics work. Those are all questions that are very much relevant to us now. One of the striking features about the Caucasian Chalk Circle is that it has a play within a play. So it starts with a prologue that's set in a totally different time and a totally different society from the one that we then see in the inner play involving Grusha and Azdak. And that contrast between those two societies is absolutely critical to Brecht's message, the idea of the play, because he wants us to see that the way things are in the present are not how they've always been. So you watch the prologue and then you go back into the olden days, you see that things were very different in the past. And that forces you as an audience to compare the two societies. You compare the people and the problems that you see in the prologue with the problems that you then see dealt with in the main body of the play. And that then challenges us to think, well, what lessons are we to learn for our own society? You know we're not just watching Grusha's story because it's a nice, entertaining little tale. We know there's a purpose to it. We know that the singer feels this is an important story and that it's got some relevance to our own lives. But even though the prologue was really important to Brecht's whole conception of this play, it's one that directors and theatre critics and audiences have often found quite problematic. And that's because of the very specific context in which he set the prologue. He set it in the Soviet Union, and he presents us with quite an idealistic view of Soviet society in that prologue. So you see the people having power in their hands, being able to take decisions, coming to an amicable agreement. And a lot of that jars with what we know of the Soviet Union and of the very undemocratic processes by which it was ruled. And audiences have found that quite problematic, and directors have often chosen, because of the politics of the prologue, to miss it out completely, or to change it fundamentally. I think the problem, though, is if you miss it out completely, then it's very difficult to see or understand why we're watching Grusha's story, or what we're supposed to look out for. If we've seen the prologue, we know that we're supposed to be focusing on questions like ownership and justice, and that changes the way in which we watch Grusha's story and changes what we look out for. Well, Brecht was a very varied writer, so it's hard to distill things down to a set formula. But one thing that the Caucasian Chalk Circle has in common with other plays that Brecht wrote around the same time is this use of a very strong central figure who goes on a learning journey that the audience follows. Something else it has in common with other plays is this emphasis on storytelling, an emphasis on storytelling that makes us realise we're watching not a slice of life, but a story that's being told to us for a reason. I guess what makes the Caucasian Chalk Circle different, though, is that we do have a narrator, a singer, who's actually on stage. So in other plays, Brecht might use other devices to show that he's telling a story. So we might see banners above the stage, or we might see projected slides. In this play, though, he has a narrator on stage, and he uses the device, that age-old device of a play within a play. So those two things are unusual for Brecht, but they do fit into his broader vision of a theatre that tells stories. Another thing that's a bit unusual about the Caucasian Chalk Circle is that things end well. Things end well, and we have a happy ending within the play within a play. And one thing that Brecht does is he really emphasises just how unusual it is. He emphasises all the extraordinary coincidences that are needed for somebody like Grusha to get a happy ending in the society in which she lives. The implication then, of course, is that we in the audience need to change the society so that it isn't the exception, but it's the norm. Grusha is an incredibly powerful character, one of the strongest characters Brecht created. And I think she's so powerful because she makes such an incredible journey. If you look at her in the first scenes that we see her, she's the sucker, as Brecht described her, the person who can never say no to anything, who's always put upon by everybody else. But she goes on this amazing journey and she faces test after test after test, and the stakes rise each time, and she passes all of those tests. So we really start to identify with her. We know she deserves to keep Michael, the child, but we don't know if things are going to work out for her. So we're really sitting on the edges of our seat, hoping against hope that she gets a fair deal, and also willing her on to carry on fighting her corner. Well, when we see Grusha for the first time, we don't really get the impression that she's going to become this amazing heroine. I mean, she's a bit tongue-tied and a bit slow off the mark when she talks to Simon, and she ends up with a baby because nobody else wants it. She's the one who's too slow to get out of the palace and save her own skin. But we see the journey that she then goes on, and we see how by facing a series of tests, each one bigger than the last one, she makes this incredible journey to being somebody who takes amazing risks because it's the right thing to do to protect Michael. And if she makes this journey, if Grusha can make this journey being quite slow-witted at the start, then any of us can. So it's really empowering, it's an empowering story. And even at the end of the play, in the court scene at the end, Grusha doesn't have the fancy arguments. She isn't articulate. We worry about whether she's going to be able to fight her corner against the fancy lawyers that Nutella has hired. And yet somehow, in very plain, simple language, she eventually manages to tell Aztec what she thinks of him and why she should get to keep Michael. Brecht was, through this play, trying to challenge his audiences not just to put up with the status quo. He was trying to challenge audiences to question things that they'd always taken for granted about the world. You know, when we start watching the prologue, I think a first reaction would be, well, of course the land belongs to the goat farmers. They're the ones who've always farmed on it. They've only left it temporarily. But Brecht challenges us to rethink those assumptions and to question the way in which the world we live in is set up. Another key message that Brecht has in the Caucasian Chalk Circle is the relationship between the law and justice. I think we tend to assume that law and justice are the same thing, but in the Caucasian Chalk Circle he shows that they can be very different things. For example, when we see Aztak acting as judge, he is the worst judge you could ever imagine. He's such a maverick figure. He's sitting there with his beer bottles, he's sitting on the law books instead of reading them, and he's making all of these crazy judgments that are actually really hard to follow and are blatantly unjust. And yet at the same time, there's a perverse fairness that emerges from some of his judgments. And that really gets us to start thinking, you know, if the legal system in a society itself is perhaps skewed in favour of the rich, maybe you need a corrupt, bent judge to try and tweak things and rejig things so that the poor can get a fair deal. But of course, Brecht doesn't want us to be satisfied just with that. He wants us to rethink the way in which law and justice themselves work, and he's suggesting that perhaps we need a different society, a different way of arranging these things. I think there are lots of issues in the world today that resonate with Brecht's views and arguments in the Caucasian Chalk Circle. Questions like social justice, questions like the relationship between justice and the law, questions about the sort of society we want to live in, whether we're satisfied with the way things are at the moment. But you know, there are lots of things in the world today that make me think of Brecht. One thing about Brecht is that quotations from his works pop up in the most unexpected places. I was walking around in Berlin a few months ago, and I saw some graffiti on a wall, which was a quotation out of one of his other plays, the Threepenny Opera, about how breaking into a bank isn't the real crime. It's the founding of a bank in the first place that's the real crime. So you can see how the financial crisis had made people turn to Brecht and make his work suddenly seem relevant. I mean, we're filming this a few days after the referendum on Scottish independence, and I found myself thinking a lot about Brecht in the last few days. I went past the Scottish Parliament on the eve of the referendum, and I saw the Scottish flag, the saltire, flying alongside the Union Jack. And it's something I wouldn't normally have thought about. But suddenly, when the existence of the United Kingdom was in doubt, suddenly seeing those two flags alongside each other was something that had a new meaning, and had another new meaning the day after the referendum, after Scotland had voted to stay in the UK. So we'd had a sort of an estrangement, an alienation of the United Kingdom itself, the prelude to a new debate, and that's something that is very Brechtian. Brecht's plays have, of course, been translated very, very widely, performed right across the world. It's easy to forget, though, that that wasn't an easy process. There was quite a slow start, and in fact, when his first plays were translated and performed in the United States, they were horrendous failures, and one of them bankrupted the theatre that put the play on. I think the reason that Brecht has been so widely translated now is that he's had some incredible translators working for him. People who read his plays and saw them on stage and were so excited about what they'd seen that they felt they really had to share these plays. So they recognise the incredible richness of the plays themselves. So I think now we're incredibly lucky as English-speaking readers of Brecht because we have a huge variety of translations to choose from. I mean, Brecht was somebody who, on the one hand, he was very firmly convinced of his own genius. He was in no doubt about that. But at the same time, he was quite humble in the sense that he always believed in working as part of a team through collaboration, that lots of brains were better than just one. And I think we see that in the translations that are now on offer because so many really excellent people have thought their way through the problems and we can benefit from all the work that has gone in there. Something else that really helped the spread of Brecht across the world is the theatre productions that he did himself as a director in Berlin, in East Berlin, after the Second World War, at his famous theatre, the Berliner Ensemble. Now, when those productions went on tour to Western Europe, to the UK, to France, theatre critics were very excited about what they saw, and that created an appetite for the translation of Brecht's plays and an understanding that here there was somebody who had something very different to offer.